If you don't get these handcuffs off me right now, I swear you'll both lose not only your badges, but your freedom as well, the white-haired man whispered, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made even seasoned police officers tremble. Who are you, old man? A homeless guy in an expensive restaurant. You have no idea who you're dealing with, the officer chuckled, forcibly twisting the old man's arm. The next moment, the doors of the restaurant opened and a tall man in an impeccable suit walked in. His gaze immediately fell on the scene of humiliation. Father? His voice cut through the tense silence of the restaurant like a knife. What the heck is going on here? The officers' faces turned chalky white as they realized exactly who they had just arrested. The most shocking part is coming next. Stay tuned to find out how it all ends. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss it. The sun was slowly setting, painting the streets of Portside in golden hues. James Riley sat at a corner table in the Côte d'Azur restaurant, an upscale establishment in the city's most exclusive area. His shabby but clean military jacket was a stark contrast to the restaurant's elegant surroundings. His wrinkled hands, dotted with age spots, carefully wrapped themselves around the cup of coffee he had ordered to while away the time. 78 years of life had left their mark on James's face. Deep furrows of wrinkles, like a map of the path he had traveled, covered his face. But his eyes revealed an unbroken man, with an unbending will that had helped him survive the horrors of war and the difficulties of post-war life. Today he was waiting for his son, Michael, the only one left to him after the death of his wife 3 years ago. The atmosphere in the restaurant was one of luxury and prosperity. People in expensive suits and dresses sat at the neighboring tables, quietly talking and enjoying exquisite dishes. Waiters in snow-white shirts glided silently between the tables, serving customers with polished politeness. James felt the disdainful glances of some of the customers. He was used to it. He had been exposed to prejudice all his life, but over the years he had learned to maintain his dignity in any situation. His worn uniform cap lying on the table next to him, and the old cane leaning against his chair were more than just things to him. They were symbols of honor that reminded him of who he was and what he had been through. "Sir, is there anything else I can get you?" the waiter asked as he approached, his tone balancing between professional politeness and barely concealed irritation. "No, thank you. I'm expecting a son," James answered calmly, looking up and meeting the young man's gaze. "Of course, sir," the waiter replied, but his look said, "You don't belong here." James sighed. Michael was already 30 minutes late. This was unusual for his son, who had always been punctual. Perhaps he had been held up at work. After all, being the chief of police in Portside meant being prepared for any unexpected situations. Suddenly, the doors of the restaurant swung open, drawing James's attention. But it wasn't Michael. 2 police officers walked in, a tall, muscular man with a square jaw and short hair, and his partner, a thin man with a cold, unkind gaze. Their uniforms were impeccable. Badges glittered on their chests, and the holsters, with pistols and batons on their belts, made them look even more impressive. "Officer Brandon and Officer Taylor," the maitre d' introduced them, his voice suddenly obsequious. "Which table would you prefer?" Officer Brandon, the taller one, glanced around the establishment. "Something by the window," he said confidently, as if expecting the best table to be immediately freed up for them. "Unfortunately, all the tables by the window are occupied," the maitre d' said apologetically, "but we can offer you seats in the center of the room." Brandon's displeased gaze slid across the room and settled on James, sitting alone at a corner table. Something in that gaze made the old man tense up inside. Over the years, he had learned to recognize danger, and now all his instincts screamed about approaching disaster. Brandon leaned over and whispered something in his partner's ear. Taylor grinned and nodded. James watched as they headed straight for his table, their steps heavy and purposeful, as if they were on their way to apprehend a criminal rather than just chatting with a restaurant patron. "Hey, man," Brandon began without greeting, looming over James' table. "What are you doing in a place like this?" James looked up slowly, trying to remain calm. "Good evening, officers," he said with dignity. "I'm waiting for my son. We agreed to meet here." Taylor snorted. "And who is your son? A millionaire who is ashamed to appear with you in public?" These words made James's chest tighten, but he remained outwardly unperturbed. "My son is a busy man. He must have been held up at work." "Are you sure he's even coming?" Brandon asked mockingly. "Maybe he was just embarrassed to bring his ragamuffin father to a decent place." These words were like a knife stab. But James did not show his pain. Over the long years of life, he learned to wear a mask of imperturbability, even when everything inside burned with resentment and anger. "I'm sure he'll be here soon," James answered calmly, taking a sip of coffee, which had already cooled down. Brandon and Taylor exchanged glances, clearly unhappy that they had failed to irritate the old man. "Documents," Brandon suddenly demanded, holding out his hand. "Show me your documents." James was surprised by such impudence, but decided not to enter into conflict. He slowly pulled out a tattered veteran's ID from the inside pocket of his jacket. Brandon took it without even thanking him and glanced through it. "James Riley, war veteran," he read aloud, his voice full of skepticism. "Seriously? You expect us to believe that?" "This is a government-issued ID," James replied, his voice still calm, even as anger began to boil inside. "I serve my country with honor." "Of course," Taylor chuckled. "We've seen hundreds of these fakes. Any bum could buy one on the black market." James felt his heart begin to beat faster at the injustice and humiliation. He looked around, hoping that one of the customers would intervene, but he saw only curious or indifferent looks. No one was going to help an old man who was being bullied by two policemen. "Officers," James said, trying to keep his voice firm, "I'm not breaking any laws. I'm just waiting for my son." "You know what?" Brandon said, clutching James's ID in his hand. "I think you should leave this place. You're clearly not fitting in with the atmosphere here." "I have as much right to be here as any other customer," James countered, feeling his patience begin to wear thin. "I've paid for my coffee, and I'm behaving decently." Brandon frowned, clearly not expecting resistance, and his hand dropped to the baton hanging from his belt. "Listen here, old man," he said through clenched teeth. "I won't tell you twice. Take your things and get out of here before we decide to arrest you for vagrancy and resisting the police." The restaurant was silent. Conversations at nearby tables had died down, and everyone watched the confrontation with tension. James knew the situation was becoming dangerous, but something inside him, the same steely will that had helped him survive on the battlefield, would not allow him to submit to this injustice. "I didn't do anything illegal," he repeated, looking Brandon straight in the eye. "And I'm not leaving here until I see my son." Brandon's face twisted in rage. He threw James's ID card on the table and grabbed him by the collar of his jacket in a sharp movement. "Get up," he growled, yanking the old man up. "You're under arrest for disobeying a police officer." James tried to free himself, but the young policeman's grip was too strong. The sudden movement caused his cane to fall to the floor with a dull thud. "My cane," James said, trying to bend down to pick it up. "I need my cane." Taylor smirked as he stepped on his cane, making the sound of wood breaking. "Oh, what a pity," he said, pretending to lament. "It seems your stick is broken." James felt a chill spread through his chest, a sense of helplessness and humiliation. He had had the cane for over 20 years, ever since an old wound in his leg had started to make itself felt in his 60s. "You have no right," James said, his voice wavering for the first time. "I'm a veteran. I defended this country." "Shut up," Brandon hissed, twisting James's arm behind his back, causing him to cry out in pain. "You're just an old bum getting a night in a cell to sober up." Taylor, meanwhile, had cuffed James's wrists, snapping them shut with unnecessary force. The metal cut painfully into the old man's thin skin. "Hey, take it easy," came a voice from the next table. It was a young man who finally decided to intervene. "He's an old man. It hurts. Who are you?" Brandon turned to him sharply. "Do you want to join him in the cell for interfering with the police?" The man immediately wilted and lowered his eyes, but took out his phone and, lowering it under the table, began to quietly film what was happening. "No, officer, I'm sorry," he muttered, returning to his food. James felt bitterness, not only from the physical pain, but also from how easily people retreated from injustice when it was not directed at them. How many times in his life had he seen evil triumph because good people did nothing? "Come on, Grandpa." Brandon pulled James toward the exit. "You're going to sleep somewhere else tonight." James tried to resist, but the pain in his arms twisted behind his back was unbearable. His heart was pounding like crazy, and he was afraid that he might have a heart attack. "Wait," he said breathlessly. "My son, he'll be here soon. Let me at least leave him a note." Yes, of course, your imaginary son," Taylor laughed. "Maybe he's also the President of the United States?" "My son is the Chief of Police in Portside," James said, hoping that would make the officers come to their senses. "Michael Riley." For a moment the officers froze, looking at each other. The police chief's name was clearly familiar to them. But then Brandon burst out laughing. "Did you hear that, Taylor? That bum claims he's the chief's father. He turned to James. Listen, old man, if you're the chief of police's father, then I'm the president. Chief Riley is a respected man from a good family, not some ragamuffin son. These words cut James to the quick. He knew that Michael had every reason to be ashamed of his father, a simple worker who had never been able to give his son the life he deserved. But Michael never showed his shame. On the contrary, he always said that he was proud of his father and the way he raised him after his mother died. You're making a mistake, James said, his voice now sounding tired. A big mistake. The only mistake we made was spending too much time on you, Brandon snapped, pushing James toward the exit. They were almost to the door when James noticed something on the table. Wait, he said. My cap. I can't leave it. Who needs your stinking hat? Taylor snorted, but he still returned to the table and grabbed the veteran's battered cap. Instead of giving it to James, he threw it on the floor with a grin and stepped on it, pressing it into the parquet. The gesture was the last straw. Tears glistened in James's eyes, not from physical pain, but from the humiliation and desecration of the symbol of his service, his honor. You'll regret this, he said quietly. I swear you'll regret this. Oh, how scary, Brandon mimicked. Go ahead, threaten us again, and we'll add that to your list of crimes. They had reached the very doors of the restaurant when they suddenly burst open, and a tall man in an impeccable suit appeared. His hair was the same rich silver shade as James's, but his face was younger and more stern. His eyes, an exact copy of James's, showed first haste and concern, then surprise and finally fury as he saw what was happening. Father, he said, his voice low and commanding, making everyone in the restaurant freeze. What the heck is going on here? Officers Brandon and Taylor's faces instantly paled as they realized who was standing before them. Police Chief Michael Riley himself. Chief? Brandon muttered, his voice suddenly thin and uncertain. We didn't know. We thought. Michael Riley ignored his subordinate's babble and walked up to his father. One look at the handcuffs, broken cane, and dented cap on the floor was enough to understand the situation. Take the handcuffs off him, he said quietly, but with such authority in his voice that Taylor immediately rushed to carry out the order, awkwardly fumbling with the keys to the handcuffs. Chief, we didn't know it was your dad, Brandon began to justify himself. He didn't look like... Who? Michael interrupted, his voice steely. The police chief's father. And who is the police chief's father, Officer Brandon, supposed to be like? A millionaire? A movie star? Brandon paused, unable to find the words to respond. Taylor finally removed the cuffs from James's wrists, leaving red marks on them from being too tight. Michael carefully took his father's hands in his own, examining the damage. You need to go to the hospital, he said worriedly. You might have a sprained ligament. I'm fine, son, James replied, though the pain in his arms and shoulders throbbed with every movement. This isn't the first time I've encountered rudeness. Michael turned to the officers, and his gaze was so icy that they involuntarily took a step back. You two, he said quietly, but each word sounded like the crack of a whip. Give up your badges and weapons to the officer on duty at the station. Effective tomorrow, you are suspended from duty pending an internal investigation. But boss, Brandon tried to object, we were just doing our jobs. We didn't know that. Your job was to protect and serve, Michael snapped, not to abuse an elderly person, destroy their personal property, or degrade their dignity. What you did goes against everything the badge you wear represents. He bent down and picked up his father's crumpled cap from the floor, carefully straightening it out. And you know what? He continued, looking at the shocked officers. Even if this man were not my father, your actions would still be unforgivable. Every citizen deserves respect, especially a veteran who risked his life for this country. The restaurant was completely silent. All the customers and staff watched the scene with bated breath. James stood next to his son. His face was tormented with pain, but his eyes shone with pride for his son, for the man he had become. Come on, father, Michael said softly, taking James's arm. I'll take you to the hospital, and then we'll have dinner at my place. Emma made your favorite blueberry pie. James nodded, allowing his son to lead him toward the exit. As he passed Brandon and Taylor, he paused and looked at them, not with malice or triumph, but with the weary wisdom of a man who had seen too much injustice in the world. I hope you will learn your lesson, young men, he said quietly. Never judge a man by his appearance or his clothes. A man's true worth is not determined by what he has in his pockets, but by what he has in his heart. With that, James Riley, leaning on his son's arm, walked out of the Côte d'Azur restaurant, leaving behind not only a broken cane, but also an important lesson in dignity, respect, and fairness. And Brandon and Taylor stood at the entrance, their faces pale with the knowledge that their police careers were likely over. They hadn't just insulted a random old man, they had humiliated their boss's father, the man who held their professional futures in his hands. But the worst thing was what they saw in the eyes of the other restaurant patrons. Not sympathy, but contempt. Contempt for people who had abused their power to humiliate a defenseless old man. And in that moment, they both realized they had lost something far more valuable than a job or a paycheck. They had lost respect, the same respect they had denied James Riley. The sunset had painted the streets of Portside blood red as Chief Michael Riley's black police car pulled up outside the city's central hospital. Michael carefully helped his father out of the front seat, his face grim, his eyes a mixture of worry and barely controlled anger. "I'm fine, son," James repeated for the umpteenth time, trying to hide the grimace of pain with every movement. "There's no need to make such a fuss." "It's not a fuss," Michael snapped, supporting his father by the elbow. "These idiots could have seriously injured you. You could have sprains, bruises, and given your age and heart problems." James smiled weakly. "I survived the war and your teenage rebellion. I will survive this too." But Michael didn't smile back. He couldn't shake the image of his father in handcuffs, pain on his face, humiliated and ridiculed by people who were supposed to protect citizens, not abuse them. They were already expected at the emergency room. Michael had called ahead, and given his condition, everything was organized in a flash. An elderly nurse with kind eyes immediately took them to the examination room. "Dr. Henderson will be with me in a minute," she said, helping James sit down on the couch. "Chief Riley, if you need to fill out any paperwork—" "I'll stay with my father," Michael said firmly. "The papers can wait." There was silence after the nurse left. James sat with his shoulders slumped, suddenly looking much older than his 78 years. Michael walked over to the window, his fingers drumming nervously on the sill. "It's my fault," he finally said without turning around. "What?" James looked at him in surprise. "Sakinanum. What are you talking about?" "If I hadn't been late, if I had arrived on time, none of this would have happened." Michael turned around, and James was shocked to see tears in his son's eyes. "Michael," James said softly, "you can't control other people's actions. It's not your fault." "I'm the chief of police," Michael exclaimed. "These people are my subordinates. I'm responsible for their behavior, for the culture of the department. If they think it's okay to treat an elderly person like this, then I'm not doing my job well." James shook his head. Son, you can't fix all the injustices in the world, even as the chief of police." "But I can fix this," Michael said firmly. "And believe me, I will." At that moment, the door opened, and Dr. Henderson, a middle-aged man with a piercing gaze and graying temples, entered the office. "Mr. Riley," he nodded affably at James, then turned to Michael. "Chief, it's good to see you, although the circumstances are not the most pleasant." The examination took about 30 minutes. Dr. Henderson carefully checked James's arms, shoulders, and back, taking notes and frowning occasionally. "The good news is there are no broken bone," he said finally, "but you have a severe sprain in your right shoulder, bruises on your wrist from the handcuffs, and a soft tissue contusion in your back. Given your age, Mr. Riley, your recovery will take longer than it would for a younger person." "I can handle it," James replied calmly. "It's not the first time I've been injured." Dr. Henderson nodded understandingly. "I know you are a veteran, and I also know you are a strong man, but I still recommend rest for the next few weeks, physical therapy, and regular checkups. I will prescribe you painkillers. But given your heart condition, the dosage will be limited." While the doctor was filling the prescription, Michael quietly asked, "Should these injuries be documented officially?" Dr. Henderson looked up at the police chief. "Do you mean for possible legal proceedings?" Michael nodded. "I have already documented all the injuries in the medical record," the doctor said, "and if necessary, I can prepare an official report. But given the nature of the injuries and the age of the patient, if you plan to file a lawsuit, I would recommend not delaying." James, who had heard the entire conversation, shook his head. "No lawsuits," he said firmly. "I don't want to waste my remaining years in court and litigation." "Father," Michael began, but James interrupted him. "No, son, I know you want justice, and you're right, but litigation is not what I need right now. These officers will be punished for their actions, but let it be within the confines of the police department. Michael wanted to object, but looking into his father's eyes, he realized that the old man would not change his mind. James Riley had always been a stubborn man. This quality helped him survive the war and raise his son alone after the death of his wife. Okay, Michael finally agreed, but I promise you that they will answer for their actions, to the fullest extent of the law. It was already dark outside when they left the hospital. Michael helped his father into the car, carefully fastened his seatbelt, and walked around to get behind the wheel. Are we going to your house? James asked as the car pulled away. Yes, Michael nodded. Emma has already prepared the guest room, and as I was saying, she baked your favorite blueberry pie. James smiled faintly, but his mind was elsewhere. He looked out the window at the city passing by. The city he had once defended in uniform, the city where he had raised his son, the city where today he was humiliated simply because he was old and poorly dressed. What are you thinking about? Michael asked quietly, noticing his father's thoughtfulness. James didn't answer right away. He continued to stare out the window, watching the city lights reflected in the puddles from the recent rain. I think some things never change, he finally said. When I came back from the war in '71, people looked down on people like me. A lot of them thought we fought in a useless war. They called us murderers, psychos. Then things changed a little. They started talking about the importance of respecting veterans, about us being heroes. But you know, son, sometimes I think all that pretty talk is just talk. A lot of people don't really care, especially if you're old and don't look like a millionaire. Michael gripped the steering wheel tighter, his jaw tensing. It will change, Father. I swear to you, it will change. James looked at his son and his heart swelled with pride. Michael had always been a stubborn idealist, believing in justice and that the world could be made a better place. Even now, after so many years of working in the police, he had not lost that belief. You know, James said, your mother would be proud of you, very proud. These simple words made Michael blink, holding back unexpected tears. The mention of his mother always evoked strong emotions in him. Sarah Riley had died of cancer when Michael was only 15, and it was his father, a simple worker from the factory outskirts, who had done everything to ensure that his son received an education and became what he wanted. I know, Michael answered quietly, and I try every day to be worthy of this pride. They pulled up to Michael's house, a large two-story building in the quiet suburb of Portside. The house was lit up, and Michael's wife Emma was waiting on the porch, peering anxiously into the darkness. Finally, she exclaimed when the car stopped. I was so worried. Emma ran down the porch and helped Michael unload James from the car. Oh, James, she gasped, seeing his pale face and haggard expression. What have they done to you? Nothing a good dinner and a piece of your blueberry pie couldn't cure, James tried to joke, but his voice sounded tired. They walked into the house and the warmth of home enveloped James. The photographs on the walls, many of him and Sarah, of little Michael, of Emma on their wedding day, were reminders that, despite all the hardships, he had had a good life. He had raised a worthy son, had a daughter-in-law who treated him like a father, and had even managed to babysit his grandchildren, although they were now in college in another state. James, we've got a guest room ready for you downstairs so you don't have to climb the stairs, Emma said, leading him through the living room. And I've already warmed up some chicken broth. The doctor called and said you need plenty of fluids and light food. The doctor called? James asked in surprise. Emma nodded. Michael called me from the hospital and said that you were injured. I immediately contacted Dr. Henderson. He is an old friend of our family. James glanced at his son, who was taking off his coat in the hallway. You thought of everything, he said with a slight smile. I'm trying, Michael shrugged, although I clearly didn't try hard enough today. Emma helped James settle into the guest room, a cozy room with a large window overlooking the garden. She brought broth, fresh bread, and the promised blueberry pie, the aroma of which made James's heart ache, so reminiscent of the pies Sarah had once baked. Thank you, dear, he said as Emma adjusted the pillows behind him. You're too kind to me. Nonsense, she waved it off. You're the most important person in Michael's life, and that means in mine too. As Emma left, Michael entered the room. He sat down on the chair next to his father's bed, his face serious. Father, I need to tell you something, he began. What happened today, it will not go unnoticed. I have launched an internal investigation into Brandon and Taylor. They broke multiple rules and protocols. And it's not just that they did it to you, my father. They probably did it to others too. And I can't let people like that wear a badge. James looked at his son carefully. Hum. Are you sure this isn't a personal vendetta? That you're doing this for the right reasons? Absolutely, Michael said firmly. If they had done this to any other person and I had found out about it, my response would have been the same. A police badge is not a license to abuse. It is a symbol of the trust that society places in us, and I will not allow anyone to abuse that trust. James nodded slowly. I believe you, son, and I'm proud of you. They talked for a long time that evening about the past, about the future, about things significant and insignificant. And for the first time in a long time, James did not feel like a lonely old man, tolerated out of politeness. He felt needed, important, loved. And outside the guest room window, clouds were already gathering, foreshadowing the storm that would break over the Portside Police Department the next day. The next morning began in pain for James Riley. Despite the painkillers, his shoulder and wrist throbbed with every movement, reminding him of the humiliation of the previous day. But he did not let the pain defeat him. Slowly and carefully, he rose from his bed, washed himself in the adjoining bathroom, and dressed in the clean clothes Emma had thoughtfully laid out for him. When he came out into the dining room, Michael and Emma were already having breakfast. When he saw his father, Michael immediately stood up. How are you feeling? He asked with concern. Do you need help? I'm fine, James said, though his movements clearly said otherwise. Just a little stiff. Old age is no fun. Emma walked up to him and helped him sit down at the table. I made your favorite pancakes with maple syrup, James, and freshly squeezed orange juice just the way you like it. Thank you, dear, James smiled, but I'm afraid my appetite isn't at its best today. You still need to eat, Emma insisted, especially with those medications Dr. Henderson prescribed. James didn't argue and started eating the pancakes, although every movement of the fork caused pain in his shoulder. Michael watched his father, his face grim. I'm going to the department, he said finally. Today will be a difficult day. What are you going to do? James asked, looking up from his plate. What I have to do, Michael said firmly. Brandon and Taylor crossed a line, and I won't let them get away with it. Don't do anything rashly, James advised. Remember that your actions may have consequences, not only for them, but for you as well. Michael shook his head. I will not act rashly, Father, but I will not turn a blind eye to this just because it might create problems for me. Justice must be fair to the poor and the rich, the young and the old. With these words, he kissed Emma, hugged his father, trying not to disturb his wounds, and left. Emma and James were left alone. They sat in silence for a while. Then Emma asked, James, are you really okay? I mean, not just physically. James considered the question. Was he okay? The incident yesterday had stirred up feelings he had long tried to bury her, hurt, bitterness at the injustice of the world. But it had also stirred up other feelings: pride in his son, gratitude for Emma's concern, the knowledge that he did have a place where he was loved and appreciated. I'm fine, Emma, he finally answered. I've lived a long life, and I've seen a lot of injustice. Yesterday it was unpleasant, but he'll get over it. I'm more worried about Michael. He's always been an idealist, always believed he could change the world for the better, and I'm afraid it might disappoint him. Emma placed her hand on James's hand. Michael is strong, she said, and he knows he can't fix everything, but he also knows he has to try to fix what he can. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the Michael we both love. James nodded, grateful for her words. Meanwhile, Michael Riley was already entering the Portside Police Department building. Usually the noise of conversation and laughter greeted him in the hall, but today everything was quiet as he passed by. News of yesterday's incident had obviously already spread throughout the department. Good morning, boss, his secretary Linda greeted him, her face expressing concern. How is your father? He'll handle it, Michael said shortly. Linda, I need you to set up a meeting with Officers Brandon and Taylor, right now, and call Deputy Chief Harris and D.I. Jenkins to my office in 20 minutes. Of course, boss, Linda nodded. Anything else? Yes. Michael looked around, making sure no one could hear them. Prepare materials on the cases that Brandon and Taylor have handled over the past 2 years, especially on complaints from citizens about their actions. Linda raised her eyebrows in surprise, but nodded. It will be done, boss. Michael walked into his office and closed the door. He walked to the window and stood for a moment, looking out at the city he had sworn to protect. The city where his father had been humiliated the day before at the hands of the very people who were supposed to uphold law and order. As chief of police, he knew he had to act not out of personal vendetta, but out of the law and professional ethics. There was a knock at the door, and Deputy Chief Harris, a heavy-set man with piercing eyes, and Chief of Internal Affairs Jenkins, a thin, balding man with a neatly trimmed beard, walked into the office. "Chief," Harris nodded, "we heard about what happened yesterday. This is a serious breach of professional ethics and possibly job descriptions." "I agree," Michael nodded, motioning his colleagues to chairs. "That's why I called you both in. I want a full and thorough investigation into the actions of Officers Brandon and Taylor, not just yesterday's incident, but every complaint that has ever been made against them. It must be an impartial investigation, with all procedures followed." Jenkins exchanged glances with Harris. "Chief, are you sure you want to go down this path? I understand that you're upset about what happened to your father, but—" "This isn't about my father," Michael interrupted sharply. "Or more accurately, not just him. This is about these officers breaking the law they were sworn to uphold. They abused their power, humiliated a citizen, and physically harmed him. And I want to know if this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern of behavior." "But Chief," Harris said, "you have to understand how this will look. Many will think that this is a personal vendetta, that you are using your position—" "I know what it looks like," Michael snapped. "And that's why I want this investigation to be conducted by the book, with no cuts or no favors. If it turns out that yesterday was an isolated incident of poor judgment, I'll be the first to admit it. But if we find evidence of systematic abuse, I want them to be held accountable for it all. Do you understand me?" Harris and Jenkins exchanged another glance, then nodded. "We understand, Chief," Jenkins said, "and I promise the investigation will be thorough and impartial." "Okay," Michael nodded. "Now I'd like to speak with Brandon and Taylor alone. Are they here yet?" "They're waiting in the conference room," Harris confirmed. "But Chief, I would recommend having a third party present at this conversation, to avoid possible accusations of—" "I understand your concern," Michael interrupted, "but this conversation is not about the investigation. It will be a personal conversation, from the boss to his subordinates, and I prefer to conduct it without witnesses." Harris wanted to object, but when he met Michael's gaze, he remained silent. He and Jenkins left, leaving the police chief alone in the office. Michael took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger seething inside him. He knew Harris was right. He had to tread carefully so as not to compromise the investigation. But at the same time, he couldn't just stand back and watch. Not after what he'd seen yesterday. He left his office and headed for the conference room. As he walked through the department's corridors, he could feel the gazes of his colleagues, sympathetic, curious, wary. They all knew that something important was going to happen today, something that could change their department forever. As Michael entered the conference room, Officers Brandon and Taylor stood up from their seats, their faces pale and their eyes avoiding meeting the chiefs. "Sit down," Michael said, closing the door behind him. They sat down and the room fell silent. Michael was in no hurry to break it. He walked around the table and stood in front of them, his gaze moving from one to the other. "You know why you are here," he finally said. "Chief," Brandon began, his voice hesitant, "we'd like to offer our sincerest apologies for—" "I don't want to hear your apologies," Michael interrupted. "Apologies mean nothing when the damage done can no longer be undone." "But we didn't know it was your father," Taylor exclaimed. "If we'd only known—" "And that's the worst part," Michael said quietly, his voice dangerously calm. "You think it's okay to treat an elderly stranger like trash, but if you knew he was my father, you'd act differently? That's the heart of the matter, Officer Taylor. You don't understand that every citizen, no matter their age, appearance, or social status, deserves to be treated fairly and with respect." Brandon and Taylor were silent, unable to find the words to respond. "I could fire you both right now with a snap of my fingers," Michael continued, "but I'm not going to. Not because I don't think you deserve it, but because I want this to be done by the book. There will be a full investigation into your actions, not just in this case, but in all previous ones. And if it turns out that yesterday's incident was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of behavior," he paused, looking each of them straight in the eye, "I will do everything in my power to make sure that you never put on a police uniform again. Not in this city or any other." "But Chief," Brandon tried to object, "we were just doing our job. Your father looked suspicious. He was—" "Suspicious?" Michael interrupted, his voice suddenly louder. "He was a 78-year-old veteran sitting in a restaurant drinking coffee. What exactly did you find suspicious? His age? His shabby clothes? Or the fact that he dared to be in an elite establishment without looking like a millionaire? Brandon fell silent, looking down. You both forgot the most important part of your oath, Michael continued, his voice quiet again, but no less menacing. You swore to protect and serve. All citizens, not just those who look like you or who you like. Everyone. And yesterday, you not only broke that oath, you dishonored the badge you wear. A heavy silence fell over the room. Brandon and Taylor sat with their eyes down, clearly ashamed by his words. That will be all, Michael said, heading for the door. You are suspended pending investigation. Surrender your badges and weapons to the duty officer. Chief, Taylor called as Michael reached for the door handle. What did your father say about what happened? Michael turned around, surprised by the question. He said he hoped you would learn your lesson, that you would understand that a man's true worth is determined not by what he has in his pockets, but by what he has in his heart. With these words, he left the room, leaving the two officers in the silence of the conference room. Returning to his office, Michael found Linda waiting for him with a folder of documents. Here are the files you asked for, Chief, she said, handing over the folder. The cases and complaints involving officers Brandon and Taylor. Thank you, Linda, Michael nodded, accepting the folder. Is there anything I should know right away? Linda hesitated, then said, Yes, Chief. There are several complaints out there that are very similar to your father's case. Elderly people, homeless people, minorities. They all claim that officers Brandon and Taylor treated them harshly, without respect, in some cases, with excessive force. But most of those complaints were dismissed for lack of evidence. Michael felt a cold fury rise inside him. So his father wasn't the only victim. This was a pattern of behavior that they had gotten away with so far. Thank you, Linda, he said, trying to control his voice. I'll study these materials. In the meantime, there's one more thing I want you to do. Contact our PR department. I want to organize a press conference. Tonight. Linda raised her eyebrows in surprise. A press conference? About what, boss? About yesterday's incident, Michael replied. About the investigation that will be conducted, and about how we plan to change the situation so that it never happens again. But Chief, Linda began cautiously, are you sure you want to go public with this? It could cause a scandal, and some might say you're using your position. I know what they might say, Linda, Michael interrupted, but I also know that if we don't bring this to light, nothing will change. This isn't just a personal grudge. It's a symptom of a deeper problem, and I'm determined to address that problem, even if it means facing resistance and criticism. Linda looked at her boss carefully, then nodded. I'm organizing a press conference, boss. Will 7 o'clock be okay? Perfect, Michael nodded. And Linda, thank you for understanding. When the secretary left, Michael opened the folder and began to look through the documents. With each page, his face grew darker. Complaints, reports, statements. They painted a picture of systematic abuse of power, bias, and excessive force. And most disturbingly, most of the complaints were dismissed or closed without proper investigation. He put the folder down and rubbed his eyes. As chief of police, he was responsible for everything that happened in his department. And while he couldn't personally control the actions of every officer, he had to create a system where such behavior would not go unpunished. At that moment, his mobile phone rang. It was Emma. Michael, her voice was alarmed. You have to come home right now. What happened? Michael instantly became wary. Is your dad okay? Hes okay, as well as he can be, Emma said. But something happened. Someone posted a video of yesterday's incident online. It's already got thousands of views and hundreds of comments. And the TV crew, they're at our house. They want to interview your father. Michael felt the blood drain from his face. What? What video? Who filmed it? I don't know, Emma said, but it shows everything. How those officers abused your father, how they broke his cane, how they handcuffed him. Everything. And the people in the comments, they're furious, Michael. They're demanding justice. Michael closed his eyes, trying to collect his thoughts. The situation was getting out of control much faster than he expected. He'll be there in 15 minutes, he said. Don't let anyone in the house. And don't let my father give any interviews or comments. It could affect the investigation. Okay, Emma agreed, but hurry. James is upset by all this attention. You know how he doesn't like being the center of attention. Michael quickly gathered his things and headed for the exit. As he passed Linda's desk, he said, "The press conference has been moved up to 5 o'clock. And prepare a press release stating that the Portside Police Department is aware of the video circulating online and is cooperating fully with internal affairs in its investigation of the incident." "Yes, Chief," Linda nodded. "And one more thing. You have a visitor. A young man named Jason Montgomery. He says he filmed the video yesterday." Michael stopped, surprised by this news. "Is he here? Now?" "Yes," Linda confirmed. "Waiting in the reception area." Michael thought for just a second. "Bring him to my office. I have 5 minutes." Back in the office, Michael soon came face to face with the young man who had filmed the viral video. Jason Montgomery was a skinny young man in his 20s, with intelligent eyes and a determined expression. "Mr. Montgomery," Michael began once they were both seated, "I realize you're pressed for time, so I'll get right to the point. Did you take a video of the incident with my father at the Côte d'Azur?" "Yes, sir," Jason nodded. "I was sitting at the next table and saw the whole thing from start to finish. At first, I didn't want to get involved. Those officers looked so aggressive. But when I saw how they were treating the old man, I pulled out my phone and started filming. I figured if anything happened, well, evidence would be helpful. And you posted this video on the internet. It was not a question, but a statement." Jason blushed slightly. "Yes, sir. I didn't know that man was your father. I just saw an injustice, and I wanted people to know about it, so that these officers wouldn't get away with it." Michael studied the young man. There was sincerity in his words, and while the release of the video had created additional complications, he couldn't blame Jason for wanting justice. "Do you realize that this video could influence the official investigation?" Michael asked. "That it could bias public opinion before all the facts are established?" I didn't think about it," Jason admitted. "I just saw a man being treated unfairly, and I wanted to help." Michael nodded. "I appreciate your honesty and your desire to help. But in the future, if you witness a similar incident, it would be better to first contact the police with video evidence before posting it publicly." "Yes, sir," Jason nodded. "I'll remember that. And I'd like to convey your apologies to your father for not intervening yesterday." "I should have. You did what you thought was right," Michael interrupted. "And I'm sure my father holds no grudge against you. In fact, your video may be key evidence in this case." After a short conversation, Michael hurried to his car. On the way home, he turned on the radio and heard that the incident with his father was already on the news. "Shocking video of police brutality in Portside is causing public outrage," the presenter said. "An elderly veteran was humiliated and physically attacked by 2 police officers in front of dozens of witnesses." When Michael pulled up to his house, he saw that Emma had not exaggerated. The sidewalk in front of their house was filled with journalists with cameras and microphones. When they saw the police chief's car, they rushed towards it, shouting questions. "Chief Riley, what can you tell us about the video? Will the officers be fired? Do you plan to file a lawsuit? How is your father?" Michael ignored them, pushing his way through the crowd to the front door where a worried Emma was waiting for him. "Thank God you're here," she said, letting him into the house and quickly closing the door on the pressing journalists. "They've been here for over an hour. They won't respond to any requests to leave." "Where is father?" Michael asked, taking off his coat. "In the living room," Emma answered. "Watching the news. They talk about it all the time, Michael, on all the channels." Michael walked into the living room and saw his father sitting in a chair in front of the TV. The screen was showing the same video. James being humiliated by officers Brandon and Taylor, his broken cane, handcuffs. "Father," Michael called quietly. James turned around and Michael was shocked to see tears in his father's eyes. Not tears of pain or humiliation, but tears of pride. "Did you see it?" James asked, pointing at the screen. "People, they're outraged. They're demanding justice, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been treated like this." Michael walked over and sat down next to his father. "I know, and I promise you that justice will be done. But Father, I must ask, are you prepared for what this might mean? Public appearances, perhaps even a trial. Your private life on display for all to see." James was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'm ready, son. All my life I've tried to stay in the shadows, not to attract attention, not to cause problems. Maybe that's why things like this keep happening, because people like me keep quiet. But I won't keep quiet anymore. If my voice can help change anything, I will speak up. Michael looked at his father with new respect. Despite the pain, despite the humiliation he had endured, James Riley had not broken. Instead, he had found the strength to stand up and fight not just for himself, but for everyone else who found themselves in a similar situation. I have a press conference today, Michael said, at 5 o'clock. I'm going to publicly announce the investigation and the steps that will be taken to make sure this doesn't happen again. I want to be there, James said firmly. Next to you. Father, you need rest, Michael countered. Dr. Henderson said you need rest. Your injuries are serious, especially considering your age and the condition of your heart. I'll take another painkiller, James replied calmly. But if we miss this moment when people are ready to listen and act, we may not get a second chance. He'll be there, son, right next to you. He'll get through this press conference. Michael saw the determination in his father's eyes and knew there was no point in arguing, and maybe his father was right. Maybe his presence at the press conference, his face, his story, would do more to change the system than anything Michael could say. Okay, he agreed, but you'll just sit next to me. No speaking. The doctor said you need rest. Agreed, James nodded, and a spark of stubbornness, familiar to Michael, flashed in his eyes. Hours before the press conference, Riley's home became a virtual headquarters. The police department's PR team arrived, lawyers arrived, even the city's mayor called to express his support and discuss strategy. Emma, seeing all this, quietly approached Michael. Are you sure you're doing the right thing? She asked. This could cost you your career. Michael looked at his wife, then at his father, who sat surrounded by people listening attentively to his account of yesterday's incident. I've never been more certain, he said. Some things are more important than a career, Emma. More important than status, more important than comfort. Justice is one of them. Emma smiled and hugged her husband tightly. I'm proud of you, she whispered, and James is proud too. I can see it in his eyes every time he looks at you. The press conference was packed to capacity. Journalists, representatives of public organizations, ordinary citizens. Everyone came to hear what the police chief would say about the scandalous video. Michael walked to the podium, followed slowly by James, supported by Emma, who carefully helped him move due to his injuries. The elderly veteran moved with visible effort, but stood up straight, maintaining his dignity despite the pain. At the sight of James, whose face had already become familiar to thousands thanks to the viral video, the room exploded with flashes of cameras. Good evening, Michael began when the noise had died down a bit. I called this press conference to discuss the incident that occurred yesterday at the Côte d'Azur restaurant, the video of which many of you have already seen. He paused, collecting his thoughts. The man you saw in that video is my father, James Riley, a war veteran who gave his country the best years of his life. Yesterday, he was the victim of the inexcusable behavior of two police officers who were sworn to protect and serve our community. The hall fell silent. Everyone listened attentively to every word. I could stand here today and speak as the son of a man who was humiliated and physically abused. But I choose to speak as the chief of the Portside Police Department, as the man responsible for the actions of every officer who wears the badge of our department. Michael looked around the room, his voice becoming firmer. What happened yesterday is unacceptable. It is a violation of the oath that every officer takes. It is a violation of the trust that society places in the police, and it will not go unpunished. He announced a formal investigation, the suspension of officers Brandon and Taylor, and a review of all previous complaints against the officers. But then he went further. This incident has shown us that it is not enough to simply respond to isolated incidents of misconduct. We need to change the system itself. That is why today I am announcing the creation of a special commission that will review the policies and procedures of our department, especially regarding interactions with vulnerable groups of the population, the elderly, minorities, the homeless. This commission will include not only representatives of the police, but also community activists, lawyers, ordinary citizens. Because the police must serve the whole of society, not just a part of it. Applause interrupted his speech. People in the audience stood up to show their support. Michael looked at his father sitting next to him and saw tears in his eyes, tears of pride and hope. When the applause died down, Michael continued, "And now, if you will allow me, I would like to give the floor to the man who inspired me to make this change. The man who, despite humiliation and pain, found the strength to stand up and say, 'Enough,' my father, James Riley." James was surprised. He did not expect his son to ask him to speak. But after a moment's hesitation, he slowly rose and walked to the microphone. The hall fell silent. All eyes were on the elderly veteran. I didn't prepare a speech, James began, his voice a little hesitant, but then it strengthened. I just want to say that what happened to me yesterday is not unique. It happens every day, in every corner of our country. People are judged by the way they look, by their age, by the color of their skin. And more often than not, those people remain silent because they don't think their voice will make a difference. He looked around the room, and the same fire that had once burned in his eyes on the battlefields lit up his eyes. But today I say to everyone who has experienced this kind of injustice, your voice matters. Your story matters. And if we unite our voices, we can change the system. Not just in Portside, but across the country. The hall exploded with applause. People stood up to greet the simple man whose words touched their hearts. After the press conference, when they were already returning home, Michael asked his father, "Do you regret that you agreed to all this? To the publicity? To the attention?" James stared out the car window for a long time, watching the city sink into the evening twilight. "No," he finally answered. "I only regret that I didn't do it sooner. All my life I've tried not to cause trouble, to keep a low profile. Maybe if I and others like me had spoken up, the world would be different." Michael silently squeezed his father's hand, and they continued on their way in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Back at Portside Police Station, Officers Brandon and Taylor sat in an empty office, watching the news about the press conference. Their faces were grim. They knew their careers were probably over. But worse, they knew they deserved it. "We screwed up," Brandon said quietly. "We screwed up big time." Taylor nodded, unable to find the words to respond. His eyes were glued to the screen, where they were showing James Riley, the man they had humiliated, but who had found the strength to stand up to injustice. "You know," Brandon said suddenly, "I think we should go to him, to Mr. Riley, apologize in person, not to save our own skins, but because it's the right thing to do." Taylor looked at his partner in surprise, then nodded slowly. "Yes, you're right. That's right." The next morning, as James Riley sat on the veranda of his son's house, enjoying his morning coffee in the silence, an inconspicuous car pulled up to the house. Two men got out, whom James immediately recognized. Officers Brandon and Taylor, only now out of uniform, in plain civilian clothes. They approached the veranda hesitantly, their eyes downcast and their shoulders hunched as if they were carrying an invisible weight. "Mr. Riley," Brandon began, his voice unsure, We came to apologize, in person, for what we did to you." James looked at them intently without saying a word. "We know that no amount of apology can make up for what happened," Taylor continued. "But we wanted you to know that we're truly sorry, and we realized how wrong we were." James slowly placed his coffee cup on the table and sat up straight in his chair. "Have you come here because you think I can save your careers?" he asked bluntly. "No, sir," Brandon said, looking up to meet James's gaze. "We know our police careers are over, and we deserve it. We came because we wanted to say that you changed us, made us see things we hadn't seen before." "And what do you see now?" James asked, his voice calm, but his eyes skeptical. "We see a man," Taylor said. "Not a poor old man, not a drifter, not a veteran, just a man with dignity, with a history, with rights, a man who deserves respect, no matter his age, appearance, or social status." James looked at them for a long time, trying to see the truth in their eyes. Then he nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said finally. "Not because your words sound sincere, but because you found the courage to come here in person. That shows that you truly understand your mistake." He gestured for them to sit on the bench on the veranda. "You know, when I came back from the war, a lot of people looked down on people like me. They didn't understand what we'd been through, what we'd seen, what we'd felt. They judged us without knowing our history, and that hurt. But over time, I realized that their ignorance wasn't their fault. It was the result of a system that teaches us to judge people by their appearance, by their clothes, by their accent. And the only way to change that system is to change ourselves." Brandon and Taylor listened silently, their faces expressing a mixture of shame and surprise at the wisdom of a man they had considered a nonentity only yesterday. "As for your careers," James said thoughtfully, "I think the system should work as it was designed. There will be a fair investigation, and if you really want to change, that should be taken into account. But how can we fix this?" Taylor asked, his voice shaking. After everything that's happened, I can share my opinion with my son, James said. Not to influence the investigation, but so he knows I have no personal vendetta. The system has to be fair to those who made a mistake and to those who are willing to correct it. If you really want to change, you have to be willing to go through all the necessary procedures, additional training, working with community organizations, serving vulnerable groups. But why? Brandon asked, puzzled. Why would you want to help us after what we did? James smiled, his eyes full of wisdom and compassion. Because revenge doesn't heal wounds, young man. It only creates new ones. True healing comes through understanding, forgiveness, and change. And if your change can help others, if your experience can prevent others from suffering, isn't that worth a second chance? Brandon and Taylor looked at James Riley with new respect and admiration. In that moment, they saw him as more than just an old veteran, but a wise man whose heart was big enough to hold even those who had hurt him. And then James said something that changed their lives forever. Dignity is not in never falling, but in rising every time. And today, by coming here, you have taken the first step to rising. Don't miss this chance. At that moment, Michael came out onto the veranda, surprised by the visit of the suspended officers. His face expressed a mixture of anger and bewilderment. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply. "Michael," James said calmly, "these young men have come to apologize, and I believe their apology is sincere." "Apologizing won't fix what they did," Michael said. "It won't make you healthy again. It won't erase the humiliation." "No," James agreed, "but they can be the beginning of change. And I'm asking you, son, to give them a chance to change. Not for their sake, but for the sake of all those they can help by becoming better officers." Michael looked at his father for a long moment, then turned his gaze to Brandon and Taylor, who stood with their heads down. "Father, do you realize there's a whole system at work here?" he asked seriously. "After everything that happened, after the press conference, after the public outcry, we have official investigation procedures, and I can't get around them even if I wanted to." "I'm not asking you to bend the rules," James replied. "I'm just saying that if the investigation shows that rehabilitation is possible, I, as the injured party, am not against giving them a chance to improve. A person should be able to atone for their guilt through work, through education, through service to those they previously ignored. But everything must be done within the framework of the law." Michael took a deep breath, struggling with conflicting emotions. On the one hand, he couldn't forgive these people for what they had done to his father. On the other hand, if his father had found the strength to forgive, who was he to deny it? "I'm not promising anything," he finally said. "There will be a full internal investigation according to all the rules and procedures. No concessions because the victim is my father, but no additional cruelty either. If you are truly ready to change, if you are ready to work on yourself and prove that you understand your mistake, this will be taken into account in the investigation. The system must be fair both to those who violated the rules and to those who sincerely repent." Brandon and Taylor looked at the police chief with gratitude and hope. They knew the road to redemption would be long and hard, but they were willing to take it, because thanks to James Riley, they finally understood what true dignity meant. That evening, as James and Michael sat on the veranda watching the sunset, Michael asked his father, "Why, Dad? Why did you forgive them so easily? After everything they did to you?" James looked at the darkening sky for a long time before answering, "Because life is too short for hate, son. I've seen what it does to people. How it poisons souls, destroys families, divides societies. I don't want to spend the rest of my days nursing anger. I want to leave behind something better. And if my forgiveness can change just 2 people, if those 2 help change 10 more and so on, isn't that worth one act of mercy?" Michael looked at his father with new understanding and respect. In that moment, he realized that true strength was not in never falling, but in getting up every time you fell. And his father, James Riley, a simple veteran in shabby clothes, had that strength in abundance. "You know, Father," Michael said quietly, "I always thought it was me who was protecting you. But now I realize it was you who was always protecting me. With your wisdom, your example, your strength." James smiled and placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "We protect each other, son, as it should be in a family, as it should be in society." And when the last rays of the sun disappeared behind the horizon, father and son sat side by side, united not only by blood, but also by a common understanding that the true dignity of a person is not in his appearance, not in his status, not in his wealth, but in his ability to rise after a fall and help others rise. And in the town of Portside, a new day was dawning, a day that promised change. Change that began with one old veteran who refused to bow his head to injustice, and with his son who refused to turn a blind eye to the imperfections of the system of which he was a part, and with two officers who found the courage to admit their mistakes and start over. Because at the end of the day, we are all just people. People who sometimes make mistakes, sometimes fall, but always have the opportunity to get back up and become better. And this is the real price of dignity. We stray too often because we fail to see the person behind the label. But if we learn to see each other as just people, with all our flaws, mistakes, and potential for good, we can create a world where the dignity of every person is not in question. James Riley speaking to the Portside Chronicle a week after the incident.